Thank you very much. First of all, I don't feel terribly well qualified to give this talk. First of all, I'm not a woman, and it's not really a specialism of mine, and there are other people coming on that are more specialised in it, so it's rather a generalist approach that I'm going to take. So I've written A Woman's Instrument. Thomas Mace, in Music's Monument, lists 6 common aspersions against the lute that together have put it into decline. And 5th on that list is that it's a woman's instrument. Mace counters this a few pages later by saying that this should be a plus, not a minus. If this were true, I cannot understand why it should suffer any disparagement for that, but rather that it should have the more reputation and honour. He goes on, but according to their sense of aspersion, I deny it to be a woman's instrument, so as, by that means, it shall become less fit for the use of a man. For if by that saying they would insinuate that it is a weak, feeble, soft instrument as to the sound, what can that signify whereby to make it a woman's instrument more than a man's? And he's saying that if they're signifying that it is soft sounding, this does not make it any more a woman's than a man's. Is Mace right that it had become a woman's instrument? Certainly, by the 17th century, the lute does seem to have been an instrument especially favoured by women, to judge by the number of paintings and other imagery of females of all ages playing the instrument, but especially young women. There are also plentiful sources of lute music, as well as continuous songbooks, which belong to women, or for which they were the scribes. There are also sources, of course, from the 16th and 18th century, though the 17th century seems to me to be the high point for the popularity of the lute among women. In the medieval period, there is evidence of women playing the lute, though this occurs far less frequently. Across all periods, it seems, there are vanishingly few female composers of lute music, and a few examples only of professional female players. Noble, aristocratic and gentry ladies were taught to play the lute in the 16th century, and especially so in the 17th, but their performance was normally limited to and intended for the domestic sphere or private concerts. It was seen as an accomplishment deemed valuable in the marriage market, a form of cultural capital, a means to social inclusion in elite circles, and to participation in courtly manners. This talk outlines some of the themes that circulate around the discussion of women and the lute up to the 18th century. It didn't work. Is it coming through? There we are. If Mace is right that the lute was commonly perceived as a woman's instrument, what were the implications, and did it hasten the lute's decline? To address this, I've divided my talk into 2 parts. My intention is to review some of the arguments around gender and the lute, reference to commentators of the time and writers today, and to look at the trajectory of the lute among female musicians. I consider the implications of the perceptions around the gendering of the lute in the first part of the talk. In the second part, I review briefly some of the lives of known female players of the lute, the circumstances in which they played, and what their identification with the instrument signified to their contemporaries. Music itself was normally perceived and personified as a woman, or given allegorical feminine attributes by theoretical writers and artists. This is seen in the many representations of lady music in painting and in art in general. The author of the anonymous The Praise of Music, 1586, previously attributed to John Case, but no longer so, regarded her as an enchanting young virgin, I quote, fit to wed men's hearts and minds unto her. The Oxford University printer, Joseph Barnes, in his dedication of the work to Sir Walter Raleigh, referred to the book as an orphan of one of Lady Music's children. Allegorical representations of music from the 16th century tend to portray a female playing an instrument, and frequently a lute. Here are 3 representations of the allegory of music. The one by Bruegel the Younger is closely related to the painting of the sense of hearing in the series on the senses by Bruegel and Rubens, where the central character, hearing, is also a woman playing the lute. And music is transient, like youth and beauty. La Haye's, and that's the one on the left, much reproduced allegory of music dating 1649 has her tuning her French theorbo as a metaphor for harmony. In Rembrandt's 1626 allegory, that's the one on the right, Lady Music sings to the accompaniment of the harp and gamba with the lute at her feet. In each case, the sexual and seductive nature of music is emphasised, as are the sexual connotations of string instruments. In two of the paintings, Lady Music is naked or half-dressed. In the third, there's a picture of Lot leading Sodom with his two daughters on the wall, and the older woman recalls the representations of the procuratesse in Dutch art. Humanistic thought understood that music to be female, itself derived from classical antiquity. This combined with readings of the classical legends of Orpheus, Amphion, Arion, etc., where the lyre was equated with the lute, led to the common personification of music as a lute-playing female. Yet there was the danger to men that was sensual and corrupting and an enemy to masculine rationality. One modern writer, Linda Phyllis Orstern, commented that, like the early modern construction of women herself, effeminate music is light, vain and delicate, alternating delighting and deceiving the senses, conjuring powerful sexual fantasies in the male listener's mind while absolving him of responsibility for his reactions and gently depleting his virility. Thomas Ravenscroft, in A Brief Discourse on the True, it's a long title, allegorized music as a fragile, virtuous wife and mother in need of defence against the base-born common practitioners who batter her, and points out that Plato regards the principal causes of love to be identical to those of music, and attributes to music the unique ability to express the powerful passions of love with clarity and accuracy. Puritan writers of the 16th and 17th century debated the dangerous power of music to move the passions, and their discussion shines a light on the affective similarities between music and femininity. For Puritans like Philip Stubbs, music was an emasculator and destroyer of manly virtue. He evokes Plutarch in support. Plutarchus complaineth of music, and saith that it doth rather feminine the mind as pricks unto vice, than conduce to godliness as spurs unto virtue. Later, William Prynne condemned public minstrelsy for its ability to elevate the virility of men's bodies. The infamous anti-feminist Joseph Sweetnam finds in his diatribe the arraignment of lewd, idle, frowned and unconstrained woman, that's 1627, that only military marches belong properly to men, and regulates all sweet, useless music to the world of women. For a man delighteth in arms and in hearing the rattling drums, but a woman loves to hear sweet music on the lute, cittern or bandora. A man rejoiceth to march among the murderous carcasses, but a woman to dance on a silken carpet. So the gendering of the lute. In part, the lute's high standing in early modern Europe was because it was regarded as a representation of the lyre of classical antiquity, or the cithara, an instrument that also appears in biblical text. The classical lyre, in its many forms, had been played both by boys and girls in antiquity. Plato had recommended music and gymnastics for both boys and girls, and that they commenced the study of the lyre at the age of 13. The plentiful representations of the lyre in its different forms show girls and boys playing the instrument. And there's some representations here. In French and Italian, the lute is masculine, yet in Latin the lyre and cithara are feminine. In early modern Europe, the lute itself could be gendered as either masculine or feminine, and some writers like Mace refer to his lute as she, whereas others, like the author of the Burrell Tutor, to it as he. Numerous times he refers to it as the king of instruments, though to others it's the queen of instruments. Wilhelmina of Prussia referred to her lute as her pot-bellied prince. In poetry, it could be either. From its appearance in Europe, the lute was understood as a high-status instrument, helped by its perceived classical heritage. Hiroyuki Minamino, in his discussion of the illuminations of the Neapolitan copy of Boethius, De Institutione Musica, explains, I quote, the hierarchy of Trecento musicians and musical instruments, and considers the social status of the personalities, the location of the musicians, the relative size of their bodies and their costume. Lady music is central and playing the portative organ. Directly above her is King David playing a psaltery, flanked by a lutenist and a fiddle player in large size and in courtly dress. Minamino sees both the symbolism and realism of the lute and concludes that it conveys the high esteem the newly cultivated lute held in 14th century Italian society. It seems that in the Renaissance development of musical stereotypes, wind instruments were assigned to men, but string instruments were available for both women and men. Thomas Decker's Girls' Horn Book, that's 1609, in speaking of a young lady's education tells us, though she might have no leisure for such things when married, the young gentleman should be able to read and write, to play upon the virginals, lute and cittern, and to read prick song at first sight. It seems that from the many sources that touch on appropriate instruments for females, that the most popular of all were plucked string instruments, and of these the virginals come top and the lute second. These preferences seem to have remained throughout to the 18th century. North recommended the lute as an instrument for women along with the harpsichord, spinet and guitar, though he thought the harpsichord the best as it keeps their body in better posture than the other. The male attitude towards gender stereotyping of musical instruments is most clearly presented in an article which appeared anonymously in 1784, but which has now been attributed to the pastor, composer and writer on music, Karl Juncker. And Juncker recommended as suitable instruments for ladies to play the clavier, lute and harp. All have soft, delicate pluck string sounds that can serve as an accompaniment instrument. While there are certainly mentions of female lute players before 1500, it's in the 16th century that it became common for well-born women to develop musical skills, alongside languages, needlework, and religious activities. Tablature had the advantage that it was perhaps easier to learn as it required less theoretical musical understanding than keyboard notation. Though a certain amount might be learnt from socialised learning, the only way that this could be achieved was with a face-to-face teacher, usually a man, or through a self-instruction book. In England, almost all the published tablatures were didactic to some degree, and most are addressed to the scholar, who could be male or female, as with Thomas Robinson's Knight, who has children that he wants Timotheus, his lute teacher, to teach. Robinson had, of course, real experience of teaching children, as he had been the teacher of Anne of Denmark before 1589, when she was an unmarried teenager and still in Denmark. We know rather more about the actuality of lute teaching to women in the 17th century than the 16th, and from then on, pictures of young women with lutes become more common. The great picture of the Clifford family and its triptych with the left-hand panel, the one on the end there, to the left, it shows all the facets of her life. And she learnt music from none other than the young John Jenkins when he joined the household of Anne Russell, Countess of Warwick. In the picture, she's 15, and though diary mentions singing and the bass vowels, she's pictured with a lute. There are numerous pictures of young women, like the next one, which is of Anne Hayden, aged 10, and some seem to have started quite early. Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, 1528, in its original Italian and various translations later on had great influence. While the book is addressed to the male courtier, it touches upon women and musical instruments in several places. According to Castiglione, one reason a courtier should be a musician was to please women. From Hobie's translation we have, and principally in courts where, besides the refreshing of vexations that music bringeth, unto each man. Many things are taken in hand to please women withal, whose tender and soft breasts are soon pierced with melody and filled with sweetness. Castiglione holds that the instruments she studied should be appropriate. I would have her practice in a measured way, and with that gentle delicacy that we have said befits her. The musical instrument that she plays ought, in my opinion, to be appropriate to this intent. He is against her playing ungainly instruments, drums, trumpets, or the like instruments, nor should she be too flashy in her performance. Not, and I quote, singing or playing upon instruments those hard and often divisions that declare more cunning than sweetness. And if she dances or plays, she should be brought to it, I quote, with suffering herself somewhat to be prayed, and with a certain bashfulness that may declare the noble shamefastness that is contrary to headiness. Perhaps the best insight into the dynamics of the lute lesson comes from a professional male teacher to a female pupil from the autobiography of Thomas Whitethorn, written around 1576, but going back to events in the 1550s. Michael Gale's thesis on learning the lute in early modern England is mainly concerned with men learning the lute for social advancement, but touches on women as well. His case study of Whitethorn's teaching discusses the dynamics of the relationship between a pupil of higher social standing and paying, and the servant teacher with cultural capital to pass on. Gale mentions, and I quote, the exercise of specialised and desirable skills such as musical performance could create an area of advantage for the servant. His pupil reminds Whitethorn that he, as tutor, also possesses an alternative type of power. His musical skills and role as a teacher create an aura in which she invites him to exercise his dominance over her. Yet, for the reverence I bear unto her, I quoting Whitethorn, I would not reprehend her and use sharp words unto her. The latent eroticism of the lute lesson is depicted in many paintings and in reality could be an occupational hazard when teaching unmarried young women. The many paintings on these themes in Dutch art in the 17th century make the lute lesson almost a genre within genre painting. Most prolific are perhaps those by Gerard ter Borch. The pictures are full of potent symbolism, with the music as a metaphor for love and the lute itself speaking for the woman's body. In some of the pictures, the girl is unchaperoned, reminding us that the lesson might give unsupervised access to pupils, making the teachers suitable scapegoats and victims when female reputations were to be destroyed, as happened in the case of Anne Boleyn, Jane Howard, and Mary Queen of Scots, whose lutenist music teachers, David Rizzio, Mark Smeet, and Henry Mannix, were all murdered or executed. It's a dangerous job. Now, so there we have Whitehall and Anne Green. Gale considers the pseudo-courtly culture of the gentry household in which teachers like Whitehall worked. He suggests that a nobleman expected to be courted by her upper servants as a way of reinforcing her dominant social position, much in the same way that Elizabeth required her ambitious courtiers to remain servile whilst vying for her favour. Whitehall certainly was adept at such courtly play, saying in one instance, "At this time I had gotten 2 or 3 pretty ditties made of love, the which, because I durst not deliver to her in writing for fear of after-claps, I would sing them oftentimes unto her on the virginals or lute, by the which I made my first entrance into my suit unto her." This kind of eroticized interaction was itself sometimes a stylized performance. Being able to play the lute had a social dimension, and one that allowed the fashioning of identity in an upwardly mobile direction. Being able to play the lute could aid social mobility for both men and women by facilitating membership of particular social groups. Instrumental skills were an important form of cultural capital in early modern England, both for reinforcing elite status and for those aspiring upwards. Playing the lute could be a part of the collective performance of a shared group identity and an aid to social cohesion among that group and a way of reinforcing social bonds. A good example of the performance of courtierships between teacher and student is that which backgrounds John Daniel's relationship with his young female student Anne Green, that was the declared inspiration for his songs for the lute, viol and voice. Many of the songs seem to deal indirectly with their relationship, couched as an elaborate courtly game around intimate social meetings. One wonders if this is entirely one-sided, and the girl was simply a muse to excite his creativity. By revealing their songs, he admits to debasing them, but promises to make this good by furnishing her with new private songs. Daniel is unusual in dedicating his songs to his pupil, though John Atty's airs, though dedicated to the Earl and Countess of Bridgewater, were similarly conceived in the teaching of their daughters. A good proportion of British lute manuscripts belong at some point to women, or at the very least have their signatures in the books, indicating that they used or interacted with the books. Among them, one might highlight the Folger, Board, Sturt and Pickering, Berlin, 40641, and more than half the Scottish lute sources. Some, like the Willoughby, might have been shared, as the signature of his future wife, Elizabeth Littleton, is on the front recto end page, and Geoffrey Alexander suggested an initial date sometime before 1564, when Frances had married her. Did the book play a part in bringing them together? The copying of pieces provided by the teacher was certainly one way a pupil's book was put together. In the case of the Board, Dowland then corrected and added such things as tonuto marks and fingering to his pieces. Gale has written on the phenomena of the celebrity lute teacher and the social prestige of taking a lesson from a celebrated player teacher like Dowland or Rossiter, as in the case of Lettice Newdigate, who did so with Rossiter. Mary Burrell's lute tutor survives as a result of a series of lessons given by an expert player, John Rogers, to his single pupil, Mary Burrell, around 1660 or thereafter. He probably compiled the tutor from his own experiences, and the pupil copied the text, leaving spaces for the tablature examples to be added by the teacher. Surely females are suggested when in the tutor it refers to the beauty of the arm, of the hands, and of the neck are advantageously displayed in playing the lute. Rogers, we know, had other female pupils in London, among them Susanna Powich, and the instruction that you must not less please the eyes than the ears. The only specific mention of female players in the book is when he says, this is this bit on the right here, "It is true a young lady may dance the saraband with her lute." Richard Burton comments, "They that being maids took so much pains to sing, play and dance, with such charge and cost their parents to get them these graceful qualities, now being married will scarce touch an instrument, they care not for it." And the expectation in many cases was the women would give up playing once married and assume more of a connoisseurship listener role in later life, or assisting their daughters in their learning. Richard Mulcaster complained that for then lightly forgetting music when they learn to be mothers, they give it up in manifest evidence that in their learning of it they did more seek to please their parents than to pleasure themselves. But not all women gave up on marriage. The deeply religious Lady Grace Mildmay wrote in our autobiography of the period after she married, when her husband in 1567, and she was young when she married at 15, "Also every day I spent some time in playing my lute, and settings of 5 parts thereunto, and practised my voice in singing of psalms." The diaries and writings of the lute-playing Constantine Hawkins the Elder corresponded with or referred to many excellent female players, most of whom were middle-aged and married. among them Mary Killigrew, Lady Stafford, and there's a whole list of them: Johanne de Guillon, Lady of Beverning, Ursula Philippotta van Reesvelt, Mrs. Swirling, and Anne Catherine Roma, and there are others. Jan Burgers, in his book on the lute in Dutch Golden Age, goes so far as to say that, and I quote, "It is striking that most amateur lutenists were women." The double portrait by Van Mieris of François de Bois Sylvester, this is on the right, the Leiden professor of music, and his wife shows her tuning her lute, suggesting as a symbol of conjugal harmony. And the idea of familial harmony being brought about by domestic music making with the lute is manifest in the remarkable Elizabethan wall painting, and it's on the left there, at 79 High Street in Thame, now part of the Thame Museum. In the main room around a cartouche with verses from St. Paul's is a mature woman playing a lute with two boys singing, part of a bass viol and two more sleeping children. And the implication is that domestic music making would inspire familial harmony, probably in the context of accompanying psalm singing in the manner of the books of Leighton and Allison. Well, the lute is a metaphor for sex and sexuality and female seduction. This is a huge subject, and for those interested in following it up, I would direct you to Jan Berger's chapter on lute in the arts of the Golden Age, and to the chapter by Julia Craig McFeely titled The Signifying Serpent. Seduction by cultural stereotype in 17th century England. While reference to the lute is complex and has subtext, depending on how it is used, it's frequently a metaphor for sex. So that's the lute itself. The two paintings of the Procuratess by Van Bouberen and von Honthorst, the lute stands for the woman's body. The Van Bouberen picture was owned by Vermeer and included in his painting of the virginal player. Music and amorous pleasures bound up in the lute are a favourite theme in Dutch books of emblems and in Dutch poetry. The allegory of the reason for learning the lute, that's the third one along there, in the Berlin manuscript, associated with John Sturt, is pretty clear: to create love and ensnarement. The many brothel scenes depicted in Dutch art of the 17th century often centred around the lute, which, according to Leppert, had, and I quote, become a common attribute of procuresses and prostitutes who carried them into public houses as a mark of their profession. According to Thomas Coriet's Crudities, 1611, Venetian courtesans carried a lute as a badge of their trade. In Isaac Oliver's, at the bottom, a miniature of Virtue Confronts Vice, 1600 circa, the female lutenist is bare-chested with her enslaved male at her feet. Shakespeare's use of the lute is a metaphor for the dangers of female seduction, most famously in Richard III, where King Edward has been bewitched by his queen into effeminate dancing to the lute. Hortensio's attempts his seduction with his visit as a lute teacher also. Another direct use of the lute as emblematic of female seduction is when in Fletcher's The Captain, Lelia, who is a cunning widow, has a lute carried before her while Johnson's song Come Hither, You That Loved is heard. She does this to fire up the old man, who turns out to be her father, by having this provocative song sung by an unseen singer before her entrance. Just carrying a lute before you carried potent symbolism. While female composers of lute tablature, it seems, are very few, there are noticeably more composers of vocal music, normally songs, who were women and who played the lute. The most likely qualification for a trained female musician was to be born into a musical family, and that was certainly the case with Francesca Caccini, the daughter of Giulio. She produced books of songs for 1, 2 voices and opera, and was heard at the Medici court. Before her, Maddalena Calzolana was a lutenist singer, teacher from Vicenza, who produced 3 books of madrigals, and she sang to her lute. The inclusion of 3 songs in Henry Lawes's second book of select airs and dialogues 1655, by Lady Mary Deering, and she's in the middle there. And the dedication of the book to Mary and her husband, Sir Edward Deering, suggests that she was a favoured pupil of Lawes. And she has the distinction of being the first woman whose songs were published under her own name. She seems to have got her musical accompaniments at Mrs. Salmon's school, which she entered at 7. Girls like her and Lucy Hutchinson and Susanna Perrich could learn a range of instruments at such schools. Hawkins noted that Lawes had taught ladies to sing during the difficult years of the Commonwealth, and he probably taught her in the years after her marriage in 1652. That's Mary Deering. There are also a number of songbooks, like the Anne Twice songbooks, of continuous songs that belong to women. Barbara Strozzi, on the right there, of course, is the most prolific of female song composers, with 8 books of songs and cantatas. And she accompanied herself on the lute and theorbo from adolescence. Well, this is the Pietà, and we forget about all-female institutions and the sorts of musical training that they got. Theorbos were among the continuing instruments used by female musicians of La Pietà, the famous women's ospedaleria in Venice. At La Pietà, there were some 60 musicians at any one time, some of whom were listed by name together with what they played. Interestingly, there were more instrumentalists than singers, and among them a surprising number of cellists and theorbo players. The balance was unlike a modern orchestra, with far more high voices than low. So 2 tenors for 1 bass, 4 altos for 2 tenors, etc. The numbers doubling as you went up the range. Women sang tenor and bass parts, but they were few in number and doubled by instruments, especially the cello and the theorbo. One reason for using theorbos may have been because of the movability of the instruments up the staircases and into the galleries from which they performed. The institution was semi-monastic in its day-to-day operation, and the only ways a woman could leave were to marry, die, or go into a religious order. As a foundling hospital, the baby girls were deposited, normally by their mothers, who were given a token so they could reclaim them, which almost never happened. They were then boarded out until about 6, when they returned to the Ospitalia. Those children chosen for musical training, about 10%, were given an apprenticeship with an existing female musician who would normally be taught, and the girls would normally be taught what that mentor played. At about 16, newly trained girls could join the performing ensembles. They were the breadwinners for the institution, and they were better treated. They had their own rooms and better fed, including meat and fish. The institutions were under a priora who was appointed by the Doge, and all visiting male musicians there for tutoring, like Vivaldi and Porter, were under the priora and were on yearly contracts. Their role was more as ensemble directors than teachers of technique. There were, of course, other Venetian foundling institutions, like the Ospedaletta, which also had musical ensembles, though they were perhaps less famous. And indeed, other monastic and semi-monastic institutions for women only encouraged the playing of instruments, including the lute family. And there are occasional obbligato lute lines in the scores produced for the Ospedale, as in Gio Battista Porta's La Ritratto dell'Aereo, and we have the title page on the left, 1726, which was written for the visit to Venice of Cardinal Ottoboni. And all the main Venetian institutions put on events, and the Pietà performed this piece which Porter wrote for them. It's called a cantata, but it's more like an opera. And there's an obbligato lute line. What is interesting here is the idea of female theorbo players teaching younger women to play the theorbo. Well, pre-16th century, I'm going to move on quite a lot faster now. There are not a lot of references to female players, but there's lots of representation, of course, of lutes in the hands of what seem like female angels or cherubs. But is this clear evidence of the lute being played by women? I don't know. There's also the problem of knowing what is being referred to in literary accounts. For example, there is reference to Mary de Bohun, who is the wife of Henry IV, playing the kithara. But what instrument is the word referring to? Manfred of Sicily is reputed to have played the lute, and his daughter Constanza. And there were, of course, some female troubadours, troubadourists, like Beatrice de Dia, and some 20 known by name. In 1341, 7 female minstrels were registered in the Minstrel Guild list in Paris, and they would play a range of instruments, and the lute was becoming more available. But my impression is that it was not commonly taught to women before the final decades of the 15th century, though there were exceptions. Well, I'm going to move on now to some sort of case studies, really, and move quite quickly, really, of famous and very often elite women who played the lute. And here's Anne Boleyn. And what's interesting about her is that, well, she probably learnt while she was at the court of Margaret of Austria and Mechlin Palace. She was a maid of honour in 1513 at about the age of 14. She also has a lute, a music book that comes from France, where she goes as well. And there are accounts of her playing, and there's a quote there, playing the lute very well. There are other women learning at that time. Henry VII seemed to have been the first English king to systematically have his children play the lute. Prince Henry at the age of 7, but also Prince Margaret at 7, and Mary at 12, and their teacher was the Frenchman Gilles Duze. And there are references also to them receiving lutes, the royal princesses. And it seems that the generation of women born in the last decades of the 15th century, that included Anne, seem to have been the earliest that were systematically taught the lute. This is Louise Labbe, known as La Belle Cordière, and she came from a famous family of Lyonnese rope makers. Well, she received a royal privilege to publish her works, and she certainly played the lute. She cross-dressed, jousted, and reputedly took part in the siege of Perpignan as a knight. But she uses the lute in several of her sonnets and gives it feelings and passions and the status of a companion and comforter, and somewhat similar to Thomas Wyatt's poetry as well, and gives the lute powers to express feelings that the poet cannot. There's, of course, Queen Elizabeth with the quote there of her acting, in a sense, as the seductress. She played the lute early in her reign. She receives lute lessons at Hatfield because there are expenses for lute strings there. And of course, Robert Dudley, who was her favourite early in her reign, he owned a lute and played it as well. And also Queen Mary played and had lutes. There's Arabella Stuart, and she, of course, is associated particularly with Michael Cavendish, part of the Cavendish family. And she is taught to play the lute, viol, and virginals. And probably while she's incarcerated at Hardwick by Bess, her grandmother, where she goes when she's 7. And Michael Cavendish's book, his Airs and Tablatoire to the Lute, is dedicated to Arabella, and he asks her to make use of them at your idlest hours. We next have Henrietta Maria, and it's really the period, the unhappy period after the marriage with Charles I, when she's estranged from her husband, and when Buckingham sought to displace the many French servants around the Queen, that she has lessons with Jacques Gautier. And Gautier gets arrested with the suggestion that he had made improper advances to Henrietta Maria, but also to the lady in the middle, Lucy Hay, the Earl of Carlisle's daughter, who was another pupil at the time. And nothing seemed to have happened at this affair. I think it was all hype. But what's interesting is that it's the only reference to a female being musician in English court accounts between 1540 and 1750. The only one is to the lute player that replaced Gautier, and she's called Rintz de Gauge. She's a French woman. She's obviously clearly brought over to remove Gautier from the job, because it seems rather suspicious, the closeness with the Queen, at least to some people. Anyway, I've already mentioned the Hawkins correspondence, but he has a large correspondence with Gautier, and there's lots of reference to particularly Mary Killigrew in that. It's also interesting that when Hawkins' son visits London in 1652 and goes to see Gautier, he disturbs Gautier, who is teaching two ladies to play the lute. So he carried on teaching young women even into the 1650s. Well, then we have Isabella Tin, and what's nice is that there's reference to her, there's a book and there's a painting, and the well-known poem by Edward Waller, and she too had the lute carried before her, and this is noted by Dr. Kettle of Balliol from Aubrey's memoir of her. I've got next Margaret Weems, and to me she epitomises the profile of the Scottish lute player as young, aristocratic, francophile, and with a family tradition of music making and playing the lute. And a surprising proportion of Scottish lute manuscripts are connected with women as the most likely owners. 5 of them out of 8, so 5 sources. There's Patricia Ruthven's book, there's the Lady Jean Campbell book, and a couple of other Panmure books, as well as the Margaret Weems book. And her story is terribly sad, really. She started her book age 15, and it contains not only French lute music, but also songs, just with a bass line, and lots of poetry as well. And she says, at the beginning of the book, 1643, because we have the date, she makes it clear by saying, Margaret Weems with my hand, and she writes that twice. And she's the daughter of the 2nd Earl of Weems, and she lived her whole life in Weems Castle in Fife. This is Madame Bouquet, and we don't really know much about this woman, but it's Monique Rollin in the 1972 edition that suggests Madame Bouquet as the author of a whole set of pieces in a Paris manuscript, originally from the collection of Sébastien Brossard. And there are 31 pieces in it attributed to Bouquet. And Rollin suggests the author was one of the sisters, either Anne or Margaret Bouquet, who were part of a literary and musical salon. And the salon is called Les Chroniques de Samedi, held and conducted by Mademoiselle de Scudery, herself a player of the lute and singer. And a lot of lute music gets played, a lot of accompanying songs, and a lot of poetry with semi-improvised accompaniment, which Madame Bouquet, whoever she is, was extremely good at doing. And they are representative of the generation of Frenchmen who played the lute as a preferred instrument. His Arabella Hunt was a very interesting character, and she was a favourite court singer at the time of Queen Mary, and she teaches the children of James II to sing and to play, and she's credited with having an exquisite hand upon the lute. Interestingly, her marriage to James Howard in 1680, was annulled because it was found that her husband was in fact a woman called Amy Poulter, and that Amy Poulter was already married to a man, Arthur Poulter. So in 1682 the marriage was annulled, and Congreve writes a long poem on her singing. And the next is the Balcarras. Well, I did a lot of work on this, producing the transcription and edition, and there are 4 women mentioned in the titles. The titles are normally complicated, they have 2 names in them, so it might be I don't know, the yellow-haired laddie, Jean Moore's Way by Mr. Beck. And Jean Moore's is one of the most common names found in the book, but there are other females' names as well. And a possible compiler, at least I suggested, was the fourth wife of Colin, the Earl of Balcarras, and it may have been that she compiled the book by correspondence with Mr. Beck, who's an Edinburgh musician in the 1690s. Well, nothing really is known of Margaret's life before her marriage to Colin, but she is a niece to Lady Jean Campbell, who's the mother of James and Harry Maule of the Panmure manuscripts. So there was a family connection there. And also, clearly, the compiler has a daughter who also plays the lute, and they are corresponding, she and the daughter, over lute music, because it says in one place, this piece is being corrected, I've got the new version from my daughter. So there's clearly a daughter. This is Frederica Sophie Wilhelmine, and she's a daughter of Frederick William I of Prussia. She gets married to Frederick of Brandenburg, and I've chosen her as a representative of the German players in the 18th century who were women. She shared a passion with her younger brother Frederick, who's going to become Frederick the Great, and her older sister was also, that's Anna Amalia, a musician and a composer. Well, their father, that's Frederick William of Prussia, was unspeakably cruel to his children. She was imprisoned for a year after her brother's attempted escape. But the two were taught instruments, and she played at court and also could play other instruments, the harpsichord, but particularly she composed, and we're going to hear a piece later on, well, a suite actually, by her. And she moves to Bayreuth and makes a wonderful centre for culture of all sorts. Well, I'm getting towards the end of my list now, and this is Anne Ford. And Anne was something of a trailblazer in that she organised her own concerts, and they featured her composition, her singing, and her playing on other instruments, particularly the metal-strung guitar, the viol, and the glass harmonica. Most notably, her father so objected to her giving public concerts that he had her arrested, confined, and placed constables at the door of her venue to stop her audience attending. This was because of the slight to his honour. Despite this, she did get her concerts off the ground in 1760 and 1761 and published a tutor for the guitar around that time. She moved to Bath and married Philip Thickness, a well-known though controversial Bath character, and they went on to have a very long and varied life. But she played English guitar and the gamba as seen in her picture, and wrote tutors for the musical glasses and the guitar. But she also played the lute, as did Philip Thickness. So January 1761, Anne advertised a forthcoming subscription concert at the Little Theatre, and I quote, this is from the newspaper, "The last time of her appearing in public, as well as singing she promised, a solo on the viol de gambo, a lesson on the guitar, the singing of the 104th Psalm, accompanied by herself on the arch lute." And it's the arch lute that she's referred to as playing as with her husband. So to conclude and return to Mace's point about the lute being commonly perceived as a woman's instrument, I would suggest that by 1760 this does hold some water. It would seem that in Haugen's circles and in his correspondence there was certainly a predominance of female players among the amateurs that he mentions. There was also, of course, the complaint that the lute made people grow crooked, countered by Mace and the Burrell tutor, but strongly reiterated by Hawkins, and that this put people off, and it may have been particularly worrying to female players. There was also, and I've sketched over it, but the accumulated associated baggage of the instrument's symbolism, that it could be seen as a metaphor for sex. My feeling is that, like Mace, however, if it was a woman's instrument, I quote, rather that it should have the more reputation and honour.
speak, if you ask a question, can you please speak with very good diction so that the my little recorder can pick it up, because often I can't, when I do the transcript at the end, I can't hear what the question was.
So that I can hear, my fear is always to hear the questions afterwards, not giving the talk. And it's because I struggle always to hear. I used to have to tell my students, the first thing I did when I started teaching a new group, to explain to them that if they wanted to say something, I had to see them first. I would never hear them without seeing them.
So many questions? No? So far?
Yes.
Did you come across much information about female Orffarian players?
No. Do you think it was particularly associated with women, the Orffarian?
I've certainly heard of two references, Lady Margaret Hoby being one of them, and I wondered if you knew more.
I don't, but maybe there are references to in the forthcoming book by Ian that I hope is going to come out, and he certainly does talk about why strong instruments.
Well, I've got a comment. Is we were talking about John Daniel and how the whole book is a sort of depiction of the kind of almost a performative courtship.
It's a performative courtship.
But and she's kind of been given all the it's like a moral training course for a young woman. These are all the arguments these dodgy young men will put to you, and this must be your answer. But there's a parallel, an exact parallel with Campion's Book of Songs. The first song is a classical mythology song, which is an invitation to love, and then at the end, which is it's the story of Apollo and Daphne in that, and in Daniel, and in Campion's Book of Songs, it's My Sweetest Lesbia, Let Us Live in Love, and the collection concludes with a Christian or moralistic reassurance that somebody's virtue is definitely not, and we are Christians after all. So in Campion, it's Come Let Us Sound with Melody, the praise of the Creator, and in Daniel, it's Mrs. Green, her leaves be green, so in other words, she's definitely still a virgin, this guy is. So.
But he doesn't, in an introduction, he says, explain that he's come out of that dynamic relationship with a female pupil that Daniel does. That's what's nice about it. And I talked here before about John Daniel's book, and he did, it seems, go out to Great Milton, and the house is still there, the whole collection of houses, and then probably after the rest went back to Oxford. At least that's what I think he did, because the distance is quite traversable by horse.
Well, it's a restaurant now, isn't it? Country Saison.
Yes, that's part of the
very expensive
complex of houses that came from that time. Yes.
Any more questions?
Yes.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Matthew. I was wondering if, in your research, you come across any references to, continental references to the playing of lute by women in religious life in convents and nunneries and its use for contemplation.
Not particularly in religious institutions. Certainly, we forget how much psalm singing there went on. Women absolutely did that, but not particularly in religious institutions. I know that, as I said, they did teach instruments for their performances. But the whole business of religious institutions, I think, is a very potent area for research, and we forget quite how much music was used. The kind of German monasteries in the 18th century, where they used music instruments to gather interest from young men to come and join the monastic institutions. Because that's what I think went on, was a way, in a sense, of generating interest in them.
But I think some of the female composers, we have Cozzolani, and some of the female composers were attached to convents.
Absolutely.
So upper class girls going into the convents, that was one of the kind of compensations in their lives. So they must have played in. They must have played.
There is a reference now. I can't remember the details. Perhaps someone knows it. Of a lady in a convent depends on whether this portrait is the person that they think it is. But it's around the 1720s, and it's assumed to be the Countess Corzo, and she's depicted playing an 11-course lute. It's clearly, as I say, that there's a possible date of 1720s, but the instrument is clearly an instrument from around 1600, which has been converted into a baroque lute in a normal way. If it is Countess Corzo, that's Anna Constantia von Barockdorf. She was the Reichsgräfin Corzo. She was a mistress of Friedrich Augustus the Strong, who was the Elector of Saxony. And the story is that the Elector of Saxony wanted to become King of Poland. And of course he had to become a Catholic in order to be King of Poland, which he duly did. His wife refused to convert and remained Protestant. In fact, it was at her funeral, Bach wrote as Die Trauerrede. But the king did become, the elector did become King of Poland. Then the Polish faction of the court thought he ought to have a Polish mistress and get rid of Countess Corzo. She wasn't having any of this. And in all the rumpus that followed, she was arrested. She escaped and I think got as far as Berlin, was rearrested, taken back and imprisoned in a castle outside Dresden. And this was in 1717. She was born in 1680. And she spent the rest of her life in this castle. She died at the age of 85, I think, having outlived the elector and his son. I presume, although I don't know, I'm no expert on it, that this was more house arrest, what we might call house arrest, but she wasn't allowed to leave the castle and she was imprisoned. It was a tower in this castle you can still visit it. And, but this portrait, if it is she, was painted during when she was already in prison. And there is another portrait which is reckoned to be her, almost 7 years, in old age. So it was possible for her to have portraits painted while she was under arrest. And this is by Louis de Sylvestre, the artist, who was the court fan, born outside Paris, but he became a court painter in Dresden. For the anoraks, well, of course I'm sure there are no anoraks in it. It's the best representation of baroque lute stringing I know. But that's an aside. But I mean, there we have, if it is she, it's a lady under arrest in this castle, playing a lute. The lute is brilliantly depicted, so the artist or his assistant certainly knew about lute. The detail is terrific and what we would expect. If it isn't she, then it would be very nice to know who it is. As I say, it's by the Dresden court painter, so if it isn't she, it's somebody else at court or associated with the court. And I would love to find out whether there's any other likely candidate. But again, it's a nice picture of someone playing on, as I said, an old lute converted. It has blue treble strings, first 3 courses. Mace talks about that. Constantine Howkins refers to these blue strings as being very good, so she obviously had access to blue strings.
Well, that sounds like we'll put it on the front cover of the news. And,
Well,
see if anybody.
When I was
one of these.
Yeah,
that painted by.
if David would sacrifice it.
Yeah.